I thought I was uncovering infidelity. Instead, I uncovered an entire second life with responsibilities, rituals, and history I had never been told existed. At first, that sounds like the kind of sentence people only say after years of therapy or after they have told the story so many times that the edges have gone dull. That was not how it felt while I was living it. While I was inside it, everything still looked ordinary enough that I kept trying to save the relationship from my own suspicions. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation smaller than betrayal, kinder than betrayal, easier to survive than betrayal. The truth did not care what I was ready for. There are betrayals that break trust, and then there are betrayals that reorder reality. Discovering my husband's secret family did both. Until that point, I believed our marriage had problems but still belonged in the category of normal human problems: stress, distance, communication, fatigue. I did not know I was living inside a much darker structure, one built not around one affair or one lie, but around sustained dual existence. The hardest part to explain to people who have never lived through this kind of betrayal is how ordinary love makes you vulnerable in practical ways. You build habits around a person. You assume cooperation. You stop scanning every interaction for danger because commitment is supposed to reduce that burden, not increase it. That is why the early warning signs are so easy to miss. They arrive inside normal life, mixed in with shared meals, errands, bills, inside jokes, and routines that still look solid from a distance. By the time suspicion feels serious, your heart is already heavily invested in preserving a life that may no longer exist in the form you believed. What I did not understand then was how much trust can disguise danger when you are invested in continuity. He disappeared in ways that did not fully add up. Some weekends were strangely protected. Certain holidays had awkward scheduling conflicts he never explained clearly. He was affectionate enough to keep me calm but vague enough to keep me uninformed. I noticed the gaps, but because I was thinking inside the limits of ordinary marriage trouble, I kept searching for ordinary explanations. That was my mistake. I was using the scale of my own honesty to estimate his capacity for deceit. I kept minimizing it because I wanted the relationship to remain something I could repair with patience rather than something I would have to survive by leaving. What made it worse was not just the event itself. It was the way each new detail forced older memories to change shape. Moments that once felt harmless became loaded. Conversations that once felt routine became suspicious in hindsight. That is one of the ugliest parts of infidelity and deception. It does not only injure the present. It reaches backward and contaminates the meaning of things you once held with trust. What nobody prepares you for is how much energy betrayal steals before the relationship even officially ends. You start rereading old moments, checking your own tone, wondering whether you missed something obvious or whether you were simply loyal in a world that rewards people who hide well. That internal spiral is exhausting, because it turns your own memory into a witness you no longer fully trust. I lived inside that spiral longer than I should have, mostly because admitting the full truth would have required me to accept how much of my life was about to change. The truth began with a phone call from a woman who assumed she was reaching someone else. What she said in the first 30 seconds did not make sense until it did. She mentioned his name, the children, a school event, and a location I knew he had visited under completely different pretenses. I felt the room go physically distant around me as my mind tried to reject what the facts were arranging in front of me. But once certain pieces connect, there is no intellectual mercy left. Once suspicion became evidence, I entered a phase I still do not remember fondly. It was part investigation, part emotional free fall. I was checking devices, dates, receipts, and timelines while also trying to function like a normal adult. Every confirmation hurt, yet every confirmation also made me calmer in one specific way. I was no longer crazy. I was no longer misreading tension. The story was real, and because it was real, I could finally stop wasting energy trying to explain away what my instincts had been flagging for far too long. There is always a physical moment when the body understands before the mind does. My stomach dropped, my breathing changed, and the room seemed to narrow around whatever proof I was holding. I verified everything because a truth that large almost demands its own second confirmation. There were records, photos, addresses, financial overlaps, and years of hidden time. Not just emotional infidelity. Not just secret meetings. A real parallel domestic life with obligations, routines, and lies carefully distributed between two women who had both been denied the right to make informed choices about their own lives. The scale of it was so grotesque that even my anger needed time to catch up. From that point on, I was no longer trying to decide whether something was wrong. I was trying to measure how long I had been living beside it without fully naming it. The scale of the truth matters because it changes the emotional category of what happened. What hurt most was not only that he had deceived me, it was the realization that he had built his stability on the assumption that both of us would remain partially in the dark. Each woman received enough truth to stay engaged, and enough lies to stay contained. That kind of manipulation is chilling because it is not impulsive. It is operational. It requires an ongoing willingness to fracture other people's reality in order to preserve your convenience and image. Once I understood that, I stopped asking whether the damage could be explained softly. I started asking whether I could respect myself if I kept staying inside a story that required me to deny what was already obvious. Even before I made any final decision, something in me had already started separating clarity from comfort. Comfort would have meant delaying the inevitable, softening language, and pretending confusion was still possible. Clarity meant naming what was in front of me without dressing it up. That shift hurt, but it also gave me back a level of internal steadiness I had been losing for a long time. Eventually there is always a confrontation, whether you want one or not. When I confronted him, he looked less like a guilty husband and more like a collapsing administrator. He was trying to assess damage in two directions at once. That image has stayed with me because it stripped all romance out of the deception. This was not passion. This was maintenance. He had been maintaining a lie so large that exposure threatened not only his marriage, but the entire fantasy of control he had built around two separate households. In that conversation, I learned something I have seen repeated in almost every betrayal story since. When someone has been lying for long enough, exposure does not automatically produce honesty. Often it only produces a faster, more desperate form of strategy. I also learned that closure is rarely given cleanly by the person who caused the damage. More often, closure is assembled privately from facts, behavior, silence, and the eventual realization that you no longer need a better apology in order to make a better decision. That realization was painful because it forced me to stop waiting for the other person to become morally elegant after months of choosing something much uglier. After the confrontation, the aftermath begins, and the aftermath is rarely cinematic. It is practical, repetitive, humiliating, and emotionally expensive. The aftermath was complex because I was not the only person processing devastation. There were children involved. Another woman whose pain was adjacent to mine but not identical. Practical questions with no humane answers. That is the thing about large betrayal. It creates moral debris that does not fit neatly into one person's grief. I had to protect myself while also accepting that other innocent people were now forced into the consequences of choices they never made. That stage taught me more about character than the actual discovery did, because it showed me who I was becoming under pressure and who the other person remained when the lies were no longer working. There is also a social cost to betrayal that people underestimate. You start thinking about who knew what, who suspected what, and who watched the relationship deteriorate without saying a word. Even when no one intended to humiliate you, the mere possibility that other people noticed pieces of the truth before you did can feel like a second wound. It is not pure ego. It is the pain of realizing your private devastation may have had an audience long before you had language for it yourself. And then comes the part no one glamorizes. The paperwork, the practical decisions, the humiliating phone calls, the explanations you owe people who were never in the room when your life actually broke. Meals still have to be made. Bills still have to be paid. Work still expects your attention. Meanwhile, your mind is replaying scenes it cannot fix. That contrast between ordinary responsibility and extraordinary pain is one of the loneliest parts of the whole process. In the end, my decision was less dramatic than people imagine and more important than any single argument. Leaving was obvious and still difficult. Obvious because there was no future worth salvaging inside that level of deceit. Difficult because the emotional violence of discovering a secret family leaves you disoriented long after the decision itself is made. Even so, I left. And in the leaving, I began the long work of rebuilding a reality that belonged fully to me, rather than one partly authored by a man who believed compartmentalization was an acceptable way to live. That decision did not erase grief. It simply gave grief a direction. Instead of circling endlessly around the betrayal, I began moving away from it step by difficult step. Recovery did not begin with peace, it began with routine. I had to rebuild trust in small, unglamorous ways, by keeping promises to myself, by protecting my sleep, by speaking honestly to the people who had earned access to my life, and by refusing to keep confusing suffering with loyalty. That process was slower than I wanted and less dramatic than movies teach us to expect. But it was real, and reality mattered more to me now than performance ever could. A major part of recovery had nothing to do with the other person, and everything to do with identity. I had to figure out who I was when I was no longer organizing my choices around managing their moods, their lies, or the fallout from their decisions. That sounds abstract until you live it. Then it becomes very practical. Different mornings, different habits, different spending, different boundaries, different standards for what gets access to your time. The rebuild was not only emotional, it was structural, and that structural change is what made the healing last instead of feeling temporary. I discovered my husband's secret family, and for a while it made the whole world feel unreal. What steadied me eventually was refusing to confuse his capacity for deception with my capacity to heal. He lived in division. I do not have to. That distinction became the first clean line in a life I had to redraw from the ground up. I do not tell this story because I enjoy revisiting it. I tell it because there are people still living inside the version of confusion I once called normal. If you are one of them, I hope you understand this. Clarity may arrive quietly, but once it arrives, it asks something of you. It asks whether you will keep protecting a lie because you are afraid of what